Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sarah Kyman, Senior Marketing Coordinator at Perficient, and I'm excited to be moderating today's webinar, How to Drive Better Customer Service with Intelligent Order Management. We are recording today, and I will email you with information on how to access that recording after the session. Time permitting, we will answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please type those into the chat box as we go. So now I'd like to take a moment to welcome and introduce today's presenters, starting with guest speaker George Lawrie, Vice President and Principal Analyst from Forrester, Steve Gatto, Director of Order Management at Perficient, and finally Sean Breeze, Director of Management Consulting at Perficient. So now I'll hand it over to our speakers to tell you a little bit about why Perficient commissioned the study and data we'll be discussing in today's session.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And hello, everybody. This is Steve Gatto from Perficient. First of all, thank you for either joining us live today or via the recording. Boy, what a turbulent year we're all experiencing so far in 2020. So first and foremost, we'd certainly like to express that those of you and yours are staying safe and healthy. And in all transparency, we'll also say that one result experienced within our firm, at least, during the course of this year is just a continued increased demand in helping companies optimize the way that they're responding to these customer buyer expectations and fulfilling orders against that demand. Now, this is challenging as we work with our clients to continually improve the way we serve clients. And there's a lot of market studies that track the details around these challenges. Shoot, when you look at the impact of COVID alone and just omni-channel fulfillment operations, you know that half of those folks, omni-channel sellers, taking orders through multiple channels, fulfilling through various ways, you know, they're not able to keep up with demand through the course of 2020. And that biggest breaking point is supply chains and all the intricacies around supply chains. And so with that in mind, listen, we were very curious. And so with Forrester's experience and established practice, we commissioned a study to analyze the extent of executives, so this is your peers, just their approach for balancing the need to meet these demanding customer buyer expectations along with the cost of inventory and order execution. So with that, we're happy to share the results of that study with you today, and I'll pass it over to George from Forrester to begin that overview. So George.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'd like to echo what you said about 2020. What an amazing year it's been. And in fact, we've been just swamped by people asking us about how to try and fix their supply chain. And in particular, to be able to anticipate where they ought to be stashing their inventory so that they can still satisfy the need of their customers. So as you've heard, Perficient commissioned this study, and we thought about a hypothesis around this because we'd seen in all kinds of industries, but particularly I would say in retail, but also in manufacturing, there's been a big headache around trying to fulfill orders from inventory wherever it might be in the network, because at the beginning of this crisis, it might not have been in the right place. And actually, we found from this study that that's actually endemic. So what we're trying to do is to try and help understand in this study the extent to which people were really thinking about the location where they held the inventory and the extent to which they were fulfilling their orders more intelligently rather than just from the nearest location. So we conducted the survey and we looked at 207, or I'd say we surveyed 207 US-based inventory management decision makers. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see what kind of organizations they belong to. We call this Firmographics. So if you look at this, you can see 100% of the people that we surveyed were in the United States. You can see that in terms of revenue, they were more or less pretty large companies, so 12% of them with more than $5 billion in annual revenue. And the smallest ones, at least the 18%, had over 250 million in annual revenue. Of those companies, about 60%, 58% were national, and the remainder were multinational companies. And you can see the breakdown there. We tried to get this a good spread between retail and manufacturing, and then something in between, really, the consumer packaged goods companies. You see a few of them were in utilities and oil and gas as well. But that gives you a feeling for the kind of companies and the size of companies that we looked at in this study. Let's go on to the next slide. So you've seen the type of companies that we looked at. I mentioned that these were inventory decision makers, so 100% of them had responsibility for something like inventory allocation, order fulfillment, the supply network optimization that we talked about there, or supply chain commerce order management or technology. And you can see that significant number of them were C-level executives or vice presidents, and the departments that they were in, about half of them were in operations or inventory management department. Let's press on to the next slide. Now, here's the interesting thing. We're going to look at the current state. We're going to look at challenges and opportunities. And this current state, we found when we asked them in our survey, 8 out of 10 of them said, yes, we automate our processes, and particularly around ordering. So most of them said, we have some kind of intelligent ordering system. But when we pressed them further, we found that these were all really rules-based. And the most common rule, and it won't surprise you, was that they had a kind of fixed relationship between the location of the customer and the location of the warehouse that was going to fulfill them. So that kind of proximity rule was the most common one. And as we'll see, it actually is quite problematic. They also told us that they'd implemented different technologies that would provide customers with more flexibility and more information, because of course, as soon as they place the order, they really want to understand status. They'd love to see it tracked on its way to them. So they all told us, yes, we've implemented technology to do this. But in a rather contradictory way, they also told us that customers call most frequently about the status of their order and about things like substitution. Let's look at the detail on the next slide. So here you can see, yes, more than 8 out of 10 of them using process automation, but actually quite a lot of them using email as well, and quite a lot of them having kind of ad hoc systems to manage their order fulfillment. Let's go on to the next one. And then when we asked them about what they thought of as intelligent ordering systems, you can see here that almost 8 out of 10 really have a rule. And that rule is a kind of proximity rule, which has a hard relationship between the location of the customer and the specific location of the warehouse. And of course, it's because in a former age, they worried, let's say, more about transportation costs and keeping the shipping costs down than they worried about the turnover of that inventory or matching more precisely the inventory to the customer demand that they had. So some of them here, you can see 60% have some kind of intelligent allocation of their orders. But the real point is that most of them are using a rules-based approach, and this is very constraining. Let's go on to the next slide. So they also told us, and I mentioned this, that they said, yes, we've implemented great systems that provide customers with all the data that they need. So you can see almost half of them said that they had an order and shipment status notification. Almost all of them allowed, let's say, some kind of allocation around an integrated business planning or some kind of multi-echelon global inventory optimization. Most of them, or a third of them, said that they had supply chain network optimization, and some of them have what they think of as supply chain control towers as well. So plenty of, I would say, interest and implementation already in some of these technologies. Let's go on to the next one and see what that really means. But on the next slide, you can see customers still most frequently calling about the status of their order. So that suggests that perhaps if they did have that kind of notification, it wasn't working well, or it didn't work well together with the allocation of the inventory and the locations that it was in. Also notice this problem around substitution and around return materials authorization as well. So some definite issues, despite the investments and the interest that they had in that kind of technology, suggesting the investments were not perhaps mature, or we're not matched by the maturity of their organization. Let's go on to the next slide. Now I'm going to ask Sean and Steve maybe to comment on the customer expectations that have driven this kind of challenge for companies.
Yeah, thank you, George. Really interesting, I think, and certainly the data is going to validate here, what customers are actually looking for. Obviously, that increased flexibility and information around when they're making transactions, and obviously sellers, we're always trying to look to respond by automating those processes like you spoke to, through whatever intelligence we can apply to that through the ordering systems. And again, if I just point to one thing this year, I just want to add a practitioner perspective on this just briefly here. Just really around what I mentioned initially, those business challenges as a result of COVID. And for those of you that are joining us in retail and maybe you operate brick and mortar stores, one of the primary things your peers have actually implemented this year, and congratulations to those that have with some shape or form in this, is curbside, right? So buy online and then redeem or pick up that order curbside. And so it's interesting, like this is a great job responding to how customers want to, again, interact with a brand, whether that's a consumer or a business customer, maybe picking up at a branch location. But that online to either store or branch, when you're supporting now curbside, that contradicts a bit with that historical desire to do buy online, pick up in store, where traditionally we just know from historical KPIs that a third of those customers that were doing buy online, pick up in some physical location, well, they ended up spending more once they were in that store or branch location. But with curbside, customers aren't inside your space. And so there's certainly some revenue and margin implications there. Orders are costing more to fulfill, but you're not realizing those incremental sales. So when I look at current state, outside of those financial implications of things like curbside, remember staff in some of these physical locations also play a role in this. I mean, now you need to get these physical locations and the personnel kind of got to get those incentives and goals aligned of those physical locations. That's a cultural shift. It just is for those folks now to support omni-channel fulfillment. And last but not least, those personnel typically aren't trained, or it's just not in their DNA to do things like pick, pack, and ship. And so not only do you need the technology to enable it, but again, it's just a cultural shift for those folks. So what we've also seen here in just these expectations are there's got to be efficient processes to do those type of things like pick, pack, and ship. There's the logistics side of that always. And when I say this is, well, where are folks actually going to come in and pick up these things if it's not in our store? Certainly we've seen grocery have reserved parking spaces. That's predominantly been the model. But for those that don't have that just real estate available, certainly some challenges there. And there's always that talk around just omni-channel fulfillment, meaning fulfilling orders against demand. But let's not forget this current state around the reverse logistics or just returns. So just returns. So omni-channel is not just around fulfilling against demand, but also supporting things like reverse logistics or being able to support returns, regardless of how that was purchased. Through a variety of different ways. So when I look at current state and customer expectations, that's a lot of stuff that we're helping clients with today. I know my colleague Sean has some implications around today's typical just inventory management and allocation models.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And as Steve and George have suggested, what we're seeing in the marketplace from a practitioner's perspective is many companies are still very ERP centric. I spent many years earlier in my career implementing ERPs and bringing those online, and companies have huge investments in their ERPs, and sometimes it's difficult to extend past that. And as a result, what you end up with is really a rear view mirror perspective of what's happening in the marketplace versus being able to look out through the windshield and be more predictive as to what may happen. Also within that ERP-centric model, there's limited integration because it's difficult integrating with suppliers, customers, and so forth, because it becomes much more point-to-point, where you need to actually integrate with them system to system, which requires a big technical investment and a lot of testing And so you don't have full sharing capabilities with your suppliers unless they're highly strategic. We do see that in sales and operation planning, where you do link up with some of your strategic suppliers, but it's difficult when you do that because you've got such a large investment. And in this marketplace, it's so dynamic. There's a lot of lifting and shifting going on, and companies come and go a lot quicker in this environment. So it makes it much more difficult to be agile and adapt to different environments or activities going on in the environment. And then moving on to my manual comment, data aggregation. We're in the age of data, where we need to be able to view data, manipulate data, and be able to correlate certain data components so that we can make good business decisions. In this current environment where we are ERP centric and we're not working on open platforms, it makes that data aggregation much more manual. And as a result, you lose correlation and you get caught flat-footed by certain events that may be happening directly within your supply chain, where there could have been risk that would have been identified that would allow you to lift and shift or pivot. However, without being able to see correlation and have real-time visibility into your supply chain, it makes it difficult to make those predictive adaptations. And what you end up with as a result is suboptimal inventory management, where maybe you're stocking too much inventory to meet what you believe your customer demands are to mitigate that risk. So you're mitigating risk with carrying a lot of excess inventory, which is suboptimal. Or you end up with an allocation model that's suboptimal. And that, as George said, most companies that I'm seeing in the marketplace are doing just that. They're minimizing transportation costs and sourcing orders to their nearest distribution center, and at the cost of possibly margins, where they could be moving slow-moving inventory out of other locations to fulfill orders. So they're not taking a holistic view of the perfect order and maximizing margins for that perfect order, and are rather just using more simple rule-based that are configurable in an ERP setting. So that's what I'm seeing from a practitioner in the marketplace. Now I'm going to pass it over to George, and he's going to talk about some of the additional challenges that companies are seeing.
Great practitioner viewpoints. Thanks very much. And how interesting you were talking about inventory there, and the fact that, and I'm sure everyone on this call will absolutely have experienced that you would always end up with too much of the wrong inventory in the wrong place and too little of the right inventory in the right place. That's always the problem. And we found actually in this survey that firms and of manufacturers and retailers experience running out of inventory or stock out at least weekly in this survey of 207 decision makers. We also found, not surprisingly, that inventory is challenging the bottom line in a lot of different ways. Yes, the holding costs, but also the opportunity cost of the sales that you miss by not having the right inventory in the right place, and of course the margin, and interestingly, the impact on the customers long term. So if you are not able to satisfy their demand, what do? Do they come back tomorrow or next week, or do they perhaps never come back? And if we go on to the next slide, we'll see just what kind of things really were happening quantitatively around this. So we asked our survey respondents, so in how many locations in the United States are you holding inventory? Now, big country, very wide spread out market, but what we found was that on average, weighted average, companies were holding inventory in 21 different locations. That's a lot of different places to have to try and think about demand and to have to optimize the items, the assortment that you hold in those locations. Let's go on to the next slide. And we asked them then a bit about their forecasting and their demand management or demand planning, and found that just even with that large number of locations, they handicap themselves a little bit by trying to forecast for each fulfillment center. And many of you will know that actually, generally speaking, what people try and do is forecast. They try and get the law of averages on their side, try and forecast at a global or a national level, and then have some kind of allocation between the locations based perhaps on history, but based maybe even on some forward-looking predictive indicators. So I've seen people, for example, use search engine arguments and use that to help them in their allocation. So not just history, but a forward look. I've even worked with one company thinking about the COVID crisis, who's looking at the R factor that's published by John Hopkins, the reinfection factor by state and by county, to try and understand if that should affect their rules about allocation or their system of allocation. Notice that over half of them also have a mature sales and operations planning process. So that's quite interesting. I think most of those probably though were manufacturers, and quite a few of them consumer packaged goods companies who've been good at that discipline for a while. So here we can see that there are some handicaps around, yes, the number of locations, but also the methodology that they're using. Let's go on to the next slide. And exactly as we've talked about, very few companies are really prioritizing inventory turnover as a measure of success. They're mostly really looking at cost of goods sold. So what's that tending to make them do? They're looking at the lowest unit cost, which means they are going to perhaps hold more inventory than they might otherwise hold. They're looking at, if they can, minimizing transportation or shipping costs. And again, you can see that around their operating margin. So they're thinking about that, but largely ignoring the problem that there is around inventory turnover. Now, particularly if you're a retailer, this is really a challenge, because most retailers, of course, they're leasing their premises, they're leasing their transportation, their warehouses. Actually, the asset that they have on their balance sheet is inventory, and really the faster they turn that, the better the return to their shareholders. So it's a problem overall. We can see this, that people aren't putting that, I'd say, as an objective, and they're not perhaps calculating their bonuses based on that either. Let's go on to the next slide. And as I said, they're generally speaking, they're experiencing a stock out or running out of inventory at least weekly. So you can see we asked them at a particular location, do they run out? We also asked them about being overstocked, and you can see that's almost as bad. And then we looked also about things like shipping cost and lead time. So people also still naturally concerned about that. And very few of them, though, thinking about this, the marketplace penalties for missing their SLAs. And for some reason, few people in this survey were working with Amazon. But I have to say, in my own life, a lot of people are complaining about that, the fact that they're being penalized because Amazon or another marketplace doesn't accept their, let's say, their ability to manage demand in the locations where they should. Let's go on to the next slide. Having said that, they do also recognize that things like inventory allocation are very important, because we ask them, what happens if you can't meet a delayed order? Will people, maybe come back next week? And no, you can see that quite a lot of them feel that actually even a single order might cause somebody to never shop with you again. And given the emphasis that there is, it's particularly in consumer packaged goods, but also in other industries, on thinking about the lifetime value of a customer, and given the cost that there is in recruiting that first customer, particularly say in manufacturing, it's really important that we should be able to keep our service level up to them, so that we don't lose them, they don't defect because we're unable to meet their requirement, because we haven't really thought hard enough about where to hold the inventory and what inventory to hold in which location. So let's go on to the next slide. So not surprisingly, they said, yes, these inventory challenges, and they're thinking mostly about stock out rather than overstock. Yes, they reduce revenue, of course, as an opportunity cost. Yes, they reduce the margin because there's the margin on that, on the lost sales. But look at customer experience, really right up there next to the reduced profit margin. And that customer experience is what ultimately may lead to them losing the customer, losing the lifetime value that they might have expected from the customer. Notice though also that they did take into account inventory carrying costs and obsolescence and write-off. So even though they had inventory turn as a fairly low priority, they still realized that there are these excess inventory carrying costs and the cost of writing off obsolete inventory. Let's look at the next slide. And of course, because e-commerce has, first of all, it's driven a lot of expectations with customers about about universal availability, but also it's driven an expansion of the number of items that people are selling. So that long tail has come, well, yes, of course, to retail, but also come to manufacturing too. And so that's driven even more complexity around the inventory that you store and in the locations. And you can see that the customers are even more demanding in the world of e-commerce. So you can see here that people generally agree that increasing e-commerce demand makes it even more difficult for the organization to hold the right inventory in all the locations. Let's go on to look at the next slide. And let's ask now perhaps Steve and Sean to talk to us about what they've seen as practitioners around these inventory implications.
Yeah, thank you, George. Very interesting results from the study. Yeah, from a practitioner perspective, again, relative to that data from the respondents that you just reviewed, is when you consider that number of just inventory holding locations, I think that weighted average number you gave us 21, and the implications for just optimizing fulfillment against that inventory, well, you can understand some of these challenges. So for a minute here, I just want to highlight some quick points as our firm works with companies to enable that global view of inventory. That's a common industry buzzword there, that global view of inventory, and then optimizing fulfillment of that inventory against demand. I think the first point we want to just, again, draw some attention to is that term of global view. So when you think about that global view and just the challenges today that we're constantly addressing is, what is that global view? What does it entail? Well, certainly it includes inventory that an enterprise would have on hand, and that on hand could be at a distribution or a fulfillment center, but obviously stores, right? This momentum to continue to use stores as fulfillment nodes or fulfillment locations or branches in a in a commercial setting. So certainly on hand when you think of global view, but let's not forget inventory or items that are in transit. So if you have inventory that is in transit, possibly on the road, maybe it's coming over the water, containers, for example, hopefully not in the air, but that's another scenario. Like if you have then a view of that inventory, you may not have it on hand, but you want to promise orders against that inbound inventory. Common scenarios around things like ATP or availability to promise. That's another consideration. And last but not least, that global view should also take into account, right, third-party relationships. And so commonly across these 21 locations that George, you spoke to, that can entail things like partnerships that an enterprise may have with a 3PL or a third-party logistics vendor, the whole drop ship scenarios. And so now when you just think of that global view of inventory, really needs to consider all of those components. And then we get into the characteristics, the challenges today are just around fulfilling orders then, if you're trying to consider inventory from all these different locations. Listen, those that are operating in retail, certainly I think we've probably seen today transportation, delivery networks, they're very stressed, and we've seen some compromises in previous kind of fulfillment promises. For example, 2-day. I think we all are experiencing these days, like that promise of 2-day fulfillment isn't really 2-day in many circumstances. There's that. And then for those that are delivering things maybe out of stores via parcel, I think we've seen a lot of the capacity restrictions from some of the parcel carriers, whether it's USPS, FedEx, UPS. I think we've seen some capacity restrictions. And so, listen, there's all those complexities on fulfilling, even if you have that global view of inventory, but that need still exists to present that accurate view of inventory and just a lot of flexibility on how customers can take redemption of orders they could place. In addition, if you're operating in wholesale, yeah, I think you experience all those same complexities, those challenges today, especially if you're doing parcel shipments, but you probably are also addressing some of the challenges around I am shipping via trucks, right? Whether that could be a full truckload that I'm shipping out, whether I'm working with an LTL carrier, less than full truckload, or even these drop ship scenarios. When I think about fulfilling now, there's some challenges that from a wholesale perspective. And so certainly what we're trying to address is how this intelligent fulfillment, right, can help balance some of those, just not customer expectations, but let's not forget service level agreements, right? So any promises and penalties you may face for not meeting fulfillment promises. The inventory holding costs, I think, George, your data there was very interesting, not to mention transportation. So I think when we work with clients on these challenges, I think the interesting thing to take away is a lot of experience within those enterprises, within those companies we work with, and the rules can certainly do a lot to help optimize that more than just, again, fulfilling based on geography, which distribution and fulfillment center could be closest to the end client. I think the other thing that we're trying to address in these challenges today, you see featured on the slide, the last bullet here, just AI ML in these optimizing supply chain scenarios. When we say that, we do mean artificial intelligence, we do mean machine learning, and here that focus is really around, well, how can we address these challenges with this emerging technology? And we're really looking at here trying to optimize the profitability of omnichannel fulfillment by making use of all the data that John, you talked about earlier, and really trying to get to determining that lowest cost to serve around omnichannel fulfillment. So now we can consider things like labor costs, like shipping fees, like capacity, and even avoiding scenarios around things like stock out and markdowns. And so that's the interesting thing that the work has really focused on here as of recently, is trying to take advantage of those type of technologies to really optimize inventory and the fulfillment of inventory, again, in an omni-channel way. Now, I know, Sean, I know you got a relative perspective here also on best practices now around some of these inventory management and allocation models.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and all of this really ties in together. And it really comes down to, as Steve was saying, global visibility. And what the thing that is most important to me from a practitioner perspective is, one, making sure that you understand exactly what your supply chain entails at all levels, so that you make sure to gather and roll up the correct data. That's the most important thing. But first off, let's talk about open architecture. In order to accomplish this and create a truly agile supply chain, you need to be able to integrate and lift and shift quickly with various suppliers. It could be your most strategic supplier, but it could also be secondary suppliers in the event that you need to lift and shift due to issues with your strategic supplier and so forth. So you need to be able to bring these companies onto these platforms in a high speed and high efficiency way, versus the previous discussion that we were having around being ERP centric. These operate more as like a digital platform where companies can collaborate and they can share data in real time. And that is really what we're seeing across this space. And more to really the global data, this is near and dear to my heart, because when we talk about sales and operational planning and making sure that you're carrying the right inventory and assessing the risk within your supply chain, you really need deep visibility, not to just to your strategic suppliers, but also their strategic suppliers. And you need to drill down sometimes 4 or 5 layers deep into your supply chain to really identify true risk that may cause you to run out of inventory for a period of time and so forth. And that will allow you, having that granular global visibility is what allows you to lift and shift and react, not necessarily to black swan events like COVID, but if you do have a supplier that's running into, or a supplier's supplier running into financial difficulties, you want to be able to see that in their ordering patterns, in their inventory patterns, and so forth. And final trends and recommendations. Steve mentioned AI and machine learning. And I think it's important to be able to gather data from a variety of sources. It could be even Twitter feeds, and that allow you to assess chatter that's going on in the marketplace that might predict some kind of political unrest in a region of the world where your manufacturing is, that could cause you supply chain risk and so forth. So it's very important to take this global view of data to find trends that are happening in the marketplace that might predict increase in demand of a particular SKUs, or risk within your supply chain that might cause supply issues within your supply chain. And in order to obtain that information, you really need to be involved or tied into some of these digital platforms that allow for collaborative and real-time sharing of data. So with all of that said, I'm going to pass it over to George now, and he's going to talk about some opportunities to address some of these pain points.
Great point about those platforms that allow people to collaborate and respond to events as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Okay, so I talked a bit about the situation, I talked about the challenges. Now I'm going to talk about what our survey respondents thought about as opportunities. And the headline really here is that companies do plan to invest in more advanced optimization, and that they really believe intelligent ordering systems will help them to increase revenue and margin. So let's look at the detail on the next slide. First of all, yes, they plan to invest in more advanced optimization. So we heard about curbside pickup and curbside return, very interesting use cases which have grown enormously. And you can see that a lot of them plan to work on that. But also notice the next most popular is to look at their supply chain network optimization. And that suggests, those 21 locations, that they've been very stressed during this crisis, and that they're thinking maybe we should rethink this. Now, as it happens, many years ago, I used to work specifically on this. And at that time, demand, well, was fairly stable. So when you decided where your locations were, you could lease warehouses for 3 years and trucks and so on. I just don't think that's the case anymore, particularly since e-commerce came up. That kind of center of gravity for demand is moving all over the place. And it means you need to be much more agile around that supply chain network optimization. And we see people thinking about that. But look also at the third point here, this point about global inventory optimization, and right through the echelons, just as we heard, transparency, not just perhaps to your strategic partners, but perhaps to their partners and below that. And you can see more and more people putting an emphasis on this. And the final one I really want to call out is the intelligent order fulfillment system. So the idea of saying, actually, maybe we ought to think for each order, how urgent is it? For each order, are there any landed cost implications? And then to say for that, where is the best place to fulfill this? That both drives results for us, so our inventory turn ideally, but also drives satisfaction for the customer so they get it in their expected lead time. Okay, let's look at the next slide. And when we asked them about these investments that they planned, what really was the justification for it, you can see that, again, almost 8 out of 10, that number keeps recurring, are expecting to increase their revenues from it. And many of them also expecting to increase their margins. But look, third there, hoping for improved customer loyalty. So we've noticed this a lot, actually, that through the crisis, that customers have been saying, both in the B2B and B2C scenario, that they remember who was able to work with them and who was able to help them. And this affects their loyalty. So the idea of being able to give them continuous service, to be able to be in stock, that matters a lot to them. And notice also, over half of them are expecting to accelerate inventory turnover with these more sophisticated investments. Let's go on to the next one. I'd like to hand over now and ask Steve and Sean to say, well, if they plan to do this kind of modernization, what should their smart supply chain, how should it appear? What should it look like?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, George. And yeah, this slide really depicts a lot of what we were talking about on the previous slide when I was talking about kind of open open data architecture. So the large band in the middle where we say open data architecture network, that essentially is our platform. And in that platform, you've got suppliers, you've got carriers, you've got news feeds that are feeding this platform, providing information that can all be correlated. Then above the bar is more of inside your organization, where you're managing your inventory playbook, and you've got your omni-channel fulfillment engine. It's ingesting all of that information from the suppliers, your suppliers, your carriers, news feeds, whatever your data sources are, and it's building logic and making predictions for how you should set your safety stock, should you shift your inventory, and so forth. And all of that rolls up into your sales and operational planning. So when you're planning for the next quarter, for the next month, whatever your time horizon is looking like, you're taking into consideration all of these elements with the objective of making sure you're optimizing your fulfillment and optimizing your inventory. So you're maximizing your on-time in full orders, but you're also doing that with maximum margins in place. As George said, there may be orders that you can fulfill. Maybe time isn't the crunch on that, so you can fulfill some of those orders with slow-moving inventory, and you can reallocate based on that. You can still minimize your transportation. It would all be part of an algorithm that you define based on the priorities that you have within your supply chain and treating that particular customer segment. And then your inventory, you can be looking across your supply chain and making recommendations based on trends that we're seeing in the marketplace as to where you should be staging that inventory. Or should we not be holding on to this inventory because the trends are moving away from that? And so this is really a depiction of what this all looks like from an overall architecture standpoint. So all that being said, I'm going to hand it now over to Steve, and he's going to talk about one of our case studies.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And as we wrap up today, appreciate the data from respondents. George, very interesting. Sean, thanks for that view on just what all the components together can look like. We do want to just recognize that this isn't all in theory. I mean, this is some reality that's also going on in today's markets. We want to highlight just a couple of enterprises that were experiencing that common state, were experiencing those challenges, but saw the opportunity and took some action on that, and just wanted to share what that looks like and the corresponding results here. And I'm really going to focus these first two on, Sean, what you just depicted there on that omni-channel fulfillment engine and inventory management. So what you see depicted on the screen here is an example from an enterprise that operates here in North America. They're actually our country's probably the largest retailer of fabrics and crafting supplies. And it was a cloud-based solution, again, really focused on omni-channel fulfillment and inventory management. And that was the initial theme of working with this organization, which is creating that global view of inventory that we spoke to, that included, and this is really important, their store locations, with almost 1,000 different store locations. And by doing so, again, incorporating inventory from traditional DCs, incorporating inventory into that global view from store locations, they could really enable what they could offer in omni-channel fulfillment. So now imagine a single global view of inventory, a single set of processes that could optimize omni-channel fulfillment against that inventory that could be surfaced to web, right, for customers that just want to engage with their brand on the web, was also surfaced to associates in the store locations, and also to corresponding call center agents that would be operating their own optimized screen. So whether it was web or store or call center agents, again, one set of inventory and one set of, again, omni-channel fulfillment against that inventory. And again, what this really allowed them, you see some of the stats on this screen here, was just flexibility to adapt. And Sean, to use your term of those black swan events, yeah, unfortunately, it did give them the opportunity to adapt and respond to unexpected peaks as a result of COVID. quick scenario here was around some partnerships that they actually established for the production of PPE, so personal protective equipment here. Specifically, I'm referring to masks. And now with their ability to have that global view of inventory and offer clients, again, for people that wanted to produce these masks around the country, just a bunch of different ways to get the supplies that are needed in order to produce these things. Well, you saw a dramatic increase in demand. You see the stats that are reflected here on this slide. And what that really reflects is their experience of things like holiday peak volumes for weeks on end. Right, so this was really focused on omni-channel fulfillment with those inventory implications, just a great success story. If we go to the next one, the other one I want to focus on here, similar themes, is again one of our country's leading supplier of beauty products. I think the interesting thing to note here is they don't sell just to consumers, they also sell and service a lot of commercial accounts. And so when you think of beauty products, I'm referring to things here like salons. And so it was a similar theme to start with, which was around an accurate view of that inventory. For them, they typically relied on certain channels were associated to certain fulfillment centers, like distribution centers. But this global view of inventory for them incorporated not just inventory that sat across multiple DCs, but also store locations. And they began to use those stores a lot for fulfillment then. So these became new fulfillment nodes for them, especially around servicing, service level agreements for things like last mile. So for example, buy online, have it shipped out for same day delivery. Again, largely enabled through store inventory through last mile carriers. And again, with all this buyer behavior changing, now they could get a better view of inventory, could really dramatically increase their fulfillment rates against orders, omni-channel fulfillment against all this demand that was coming in. And I think the result that you see on this screen here is just some of the stats around the increase in sales. Okay, so those are first two, and I'm going to hand it back to Sean here. He's got one more for us to overview. Sean?
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, this was an opportunity for us to work with a large cable television operator. And what they were experiencing is with the number of people cutting the cord, they had thousands of technicians that were out in the field. And there was an opportunity to leverage these technicians to add new products onto their trucks that they could sell to customers when they were working with them in the home. And what we did as Perficient, our management consulting group, worked with their leadership to help define their strategy for exactly what they wanted to accomplish by leveraging these field technicians. And then we worked with that strategy to define the specific services and products that they may be offering through this new channel. And then after we had the strategy defined, and this is more in line with what we do. We help align strategy with an operating model. We worked with all the stakeholders in the process to help determine what are the people, the processes, and the technology components that we're going to need to be able to add services, bundle products onto these technicians' vehicles. So in working through that, we determined where they were going to stock all of their inventory so that they could maximize efficiency and fulfillment. How much stock were they going to keep in a rolling truck at any given time, and how would they dispatch orders through these field technicians? And through this process, we were able to optimize their inventory in their current business and also optimize the efficiency within their field techs to the tune of a $1.5 million savings just right out of the gate with quick wins. And this is just an example of kind of how we work in defining strategy and aligning strategy with the operating model. Can we go to the next slide? So this just speaks more to really kind of how we get from point A to point B, because technological solutions always sound very good, very sexy, and so forth. However, there's a list of pragmatic steps that need to occur to get you from point A to point B, because oftentimes if you take shortcuts to technical solutions, they'll end up with suboptimal results. So the first thing that we do is help assess the current state. And this is all working with stakeholders to identify the current as-is process, what are the pain points, what's the organizational design, and the current state of technology. What's the current landscape look like? And then working with leadership to find what does the ideal end state look like? Where do we see ourselves as an organization in 5 years? And then look at the gaps. What are the gaps between the current state and that 5-year strategic plan? And then help put together a roadmap of, it could be projects, it could be process changes, it could be organizational changes, all of the above in all likelihood, and build a roadmap with dependencies in terms of what needs to happen first from 1 to N in order to achieve those strategic objectives. So when I look at a project such as implementing a control tower solution to help with inventory management and order allocation and so forth, this is the approach that we would take. Now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to help take us home on this.
Yeah, thanks everybody so much. As a reminder, we're now going to open up the call to questions that have come in, or any questions that we continue to receive in the questions box. We have a few that we can start with, one of which is, what does getting started with supply chain automation look like?
Steve, if you're okay, I'll take that one because that's kind of near and dear to my heart. As I suggested in that previous slide, it really starts with mapping your supply chain, truly understanding it. And it's not to say that you don't understand your supply chains already, but it's important to roll up your sleeves, take a very deep dive into your current state and understand it, down to very multiple echelons of your suppliers, as we indicated earlier. And that is done in conjunction with, what is our strategic objective? What's the business case for executing what we want to execute, whether it's implementation of a control tower or smart order allocation, distributed order management, whatever that solution may look like. What's the business case? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? And then begin to put in the building blocks that are required to get you from point A to point B based on that future state operating model. Because once you implement these technologies, your processes are going to change, the skill sets within your organization are going to change, and so you need to plan for that. And sometimes those change management components are overlooked and can also be huge detriments to whatever your end solution may be. Steve, feel free to jump in and add anything from your perspective.
No, that's great. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for grabbing that one. I think it is right up your alley.
Yeah, and then I think we have time for another one, which is, what technologies are providing the most immediate return?
Okay, interesting. Sean, maybe I'll jump in on this one. Yeah, good. Thanks for the question there. From a technology perspective, again, just to validate some of the things that, Sean, you talked about, listen, you got to have that strategy set. I think the operating model, again, crucial importance there. And then technology for us really becomes the enabler of that. And so when I look at these technologies, listen, around all these things we've been discussing today around just global view of inventory, again, omni-channel fulfillment. And when you look at doing this across all the different channels that, you know, an enterprise will have to sell to and service their clients, boy, there's so many technologies that play a role here. I think you have sell-side e-commerce applications could be one. Certainly when it comes to stores, all the technologies that go into operating a store. So store ops is another one, I think. And when it comes to fulfillment, boy, you do see, I think the warehouse systems playing a crucial role, transportation management systems playing a crucial role. So that's a big old laundry list there. I think of anything though, and it's probably no surprise where we see the biggest bang for the buck, or where we see these immediate wins in both operational efficiencies and cost savings, let alone revenue, just generation, increased revenue, is order management. So there's a lot of different ways that you can actually address some of these, you know, evolving from what that current state is, trying to address those challenges to realize some of those benefits that George took us through. But order management really, as what we've seen probably over the last 24 months, is a technology that is providing a just dramatic impact on how people can do those things. We talked about those classic cases of saving costs and increasing revenue. And hopefully those case studies we took you through are just a good example of some of those immediate results that a few clients have seen. So all those technologies play a role that I rattled off, but order management clearly is a winner here for providing some immediate impact on investment. So thanks for that one, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that is going to wrap us up. Once again, we'll be sending out a recording of today's presentation. And if we were unable to get to your question today, one of our experts will be sure to follow up with you shortly after. But I'd like to thank everyone who was able to join us today. Thanks to our speakers. So thanks so much and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.